The cannons spoke before dawn. They came out of the darkness like a fever dream, 3 ships running without lanterns, their sails the color of ash against the black Caribbean sky, cutting through the warm, still water of the Bay of Cartagena de Indias with the patience of men who had planned this moment for years. The sentinels on the walls of the Castillo de San Felipe de Barajas heard nothing at first, only the rhythmic slap of waves against stone and the distant cry of a night bird somewhere in the mangroves to the south. Then one of the younger guards, a boy of 17 whose name would never be recorded in any ledger, saw the shapes on the water and opened his mouth to shout. He never finished the word. The first broadside erupted from the lead vessel, a frigate of perhaps 220 tons, low in the hull and fast, her gun ports bristling with iron, and the sky above the bay turned briefly white, then orange, then the deep poisonous red of burning pitch. Cartagena woke screaming. If you are watching from any part of the world, write your city in the comments and subscribe. This story belongs to all who love the sea and fear its silence. The man responsible for that first broadside stood at the bow of the Sangre Roja, the red blood, with both hands gripping the forestay and his coat open to the wind, his dark eyes fixed on the fortress, with an expression that no one who survived that night would ever successfully describe. Some called it calm. Others, in later testimonies given to the governor's tribunal in Santa Fe de Bogotá, called it something colder than calm, something that reminded them of the face of a man who has already made peace with whatever God would say to him. His name, at least the name by which every port from Tortuga to Portobello had come to know him, was Capitán Rojo, the Red Captain. His real name was Emilio Salgado de Vasconcelos, born in Setúbal, Portugal, sometime around 1671. The third son of a minor customs official who had died of fever before Emilio turned 10. He had gone to sea at 11, been pressed into the service of a Dutch privateer at 15, and had killed his first captain, a Flemish man named Horn, universally despised, before he turned 20. That killing, more than any raid or boarding action, had defined everything that followed. By 1702, the year he brought his fleet into the mouth of Cartagena's harbour, Emilio Salgado de Vasconcelos commanded 3 vessels, a crew of nearly 240 men drawn from 11 nations, and a reputation so large and so dark that merchants in Havana adjusted their insurance contracts simply at the rumour of his presence in the Windward Passage. He was not the richest pirate of his era. He was not the most brutal, though brutality was a currency he spent when necessary. What made him singular, what had earned him the title of El Capitán Rojo and given it its particular weight, was a quality that his crew recognized and feared more than any enemy cannon. He remembered everything, every betrayal, every debt, every port that had turned him away, every governor who had accepted Spanish gold to close a harbor against him. He kept a logbook written in a cramped, precise hand, and in that logbook he recorded not treasure maps but names. Names of men who owed him something, names of cities that had cost him something, names of dead crewmen whose accounts he considered unresolved. Cartagena owed him 3 names. The first was a Genoese merchant named Stefano Albanese, who in the spring of 1699 had paid the harbour master of Cartagena to deny the Sangre Roja provisioning rights, forcing Vasconcelos to sail another 4 days south to Santa Marta in a vessel already short on fresh water, a decision that had cost 2 of his men their lives to dehydration fever. The second name was that of a Spanish naval lieutenant, Rodrigo Fuentes Alcázar, who had participated in the ambush of a consort vessel, a small brigantine called La Espina, in the channel north of the Isla de Baru 2 years prior, an ambush that had cost Vasconcelos his youngest navigator and a hold full of Peruvian silver. The third name was one he had never spoken aloud to any member of his crew, a woman named Catalina, who had lived in Cartagena's Gethsemane district, who had meant something to him in a different life, and who had died during a fever epidemic in 1700, partly, he believed, because the city's colonial administrators had hoarded the medicinal supplies sent from Bogotá to distribute only among those citizens wealthy enough to pay for them. That third name was the one that made him dangerous in a way that pure greed never could. The bombardment lasted 40 minutes. It was not intended to level the city. Vasconcelos was many things, but he was not without calculation, and a city reduced to ash offered nothing worth taking. The cannons targeted the harbour installations, the harbourmaster's office, the customs warehouse on the Muelle de los Pegasos, 3 Spanish merchant vessels at anchor, and the chain mechanism that controlled the defensive boom across the harbour mouth. The Sangre Roja and her consorts, a brigantine called La Daga, and a captured Spanish patache, rechristened El Silencio, moved in coordinated patterns that suggested long rehearsal, because they had rehearsed in a sheltered cove on the eastern shore of Isla Grande for 6 days, using a sketch map that Vasconcelos had drawn from memory, refined by intelligence gathered over 3 years by a network of contacts that included a Spanish-speaking freed slave named Tomás, who worked as a stevedore on Cartagena's wharves and passed information through a system of marked cargo manifests to intermediaries in Portobello. When the chain boom was destroyed, a single well-placed shot from La Daga's bow chaser, fired by a Basque gunner named Iturriaga, who was said to have been able to thread a cannonball through a barrel hoop at 200 yards. The 3 vessels turned their broadsides to the inner harbour and the city beyond, and the real work began. Inside Cartagena, the scene was what any port town looks like when it understands, all at once and without warning, that it is not safe. The cathedral bells rang in overlapping confusion. Horses screamed in their stables. The governor, a man named Don Sebastián de Zubicaray y Mena, was reportedly found by his servants sitting upright in his bed in full nightdress, already dictating orders to a secretary who had arrived without ink. The garrison, perhaps 300 soldiers, many of them poorly paid mestizo conscripts who had never fought a serious naval assault, scrambled to the walls and to the harbour fortifications in various states of undress, some carrying muskets, some carrying only the memory of their training. The wealthy merchants of the city's upper quarter, those who lived in the tall stone houses behind the cathedral, sent their servants to bury silver and jewellery in their courtyards and gardens, a precaution that later proved unnecessary, but that archaeologists would find rewarding 2 centuries hence. On the wharves, the stevedores and dockworkers made different calculations. Some ran inland. Others, and this was a detail that appeared in several subsequent accounts, simply watched from the sea walls, their arms folded as the pirate ships came on. Tomás, the informant, stood among them, and no one who knew him could have said with certainty what expression he wore. The landing party came ashore in longboats, 40 men, chosen for the specific qualities of speed and controlled aggression rather than pure ferocity. Vasconcelos led them himself, which was not standard practice for a captain of his experience, and which his quartermaster, a weathered Cornishman named William Crabbe, had argued against loudly and at length the night before. Vasconcelos had listened to all of Crabbe's arguments. They were good arguments, grounded in sound tactical logic, and had then explained quietly that this was not a purely tactical operation. Crabbe had looked at him for a long moment and said nothing further. They took the customs warehouse within the first quarter hour, overwhelming the handful of guards posted there with a combination of pistol fire and sheer momentum. The warehouse contained what Vasconcelos had been told it would contain: chests of silver reals from the last registered galleon delivery, bolts of dyed cloth from Quito, cacao beans in sealed casks, and, this was unexpected, though not unwelcome, a locked iron strongbox whose contents proved to be a set of sealed documents relating to the upcoming transfer of colonial administrative authority in New Granada. Vasconcelos looked at those documents for a long time before handing them to Crabbe with instructions to keep them separate from everything else. Crabbe, who understood more than he usually admitted, tucked them inside his coat without a word. The advance into Gethsemane was harder. The district beyond the inner wall was a maze of narrow streets and low plaster houses, and by the time Vasconcelos's landing party reached it, the garrison had partially organized itself, posting musketeers at the corners of the main plaza and in the window of the district's small church. The fighting there, if it could be called fighting, which it could only in the loose sense that encompasses panic, confusion, and the occasional exchange of fire between men who cannot clearly see each other in pre-dawn streets, lasted perhaps an hour. 2 of Vasconcelos' men were wounded. 1 died later that morning of a ball in the lung. 4 Spanish soldiers were killed and a dozen injured. The rest pulled back toward the main city walls. Vasconcelos stood in the plaza of Gethsemane as the sky began to show its first grey light, and he looked at the street he had been told about, the one where Catalina had lived. And he stood there for a moment that several of his men later described as feeling very long. Then he turned away and gave the order to begin systematic looting of the warehouse district. He did not enter that street. He never entered it. This detail, small as it was, would become one of the things that people remembered about the Cartagena raid in the years and decades that followed, that the Red Captain, who had crossed hundreds of leagues of open sea to settle accounts with this city, had stood at the threshold of the one street that held no commercial value and had turned away. It was the sort of detail that accumulated meaning over time, that grew heavier the more it was repeated, until it became impossible to separate what it meant from what it felt like, which was the weight of a man carrying something too large to put down and too painful to keep holding. By mid-morning, the Sangre Roja and her consorts had taken on a substantial portion of the customs warehouse's contents, had destroyed 3 of the harbor's mooring cranes, and had made it abundantly clear to the city's administration that the boom chain, once its primary defense, was now iron debris on the harbor bottom. Vasconcelos had also, through intermediaries sent under a flag of parley to the governor's residence, delivered a written list of demands. Repayment of a specific sum in silver, corresponding, he claimed, to the value of the water and provisions denied to him in 1699. The release of 6 sailors currently held in the city's prison on charges of piracy. 4 of them were genuinely his men. 2 he had never heard of, but included on principle. And a written acknowledgement, signed by the governor, that Lieutenant Rodrigo Fuentes Alcázar had participated in an illegal ambush of a vessel operating under letters of marque. The governor refused all 3 demands, which Vasconcelos had expected. What he had not expected was the arrival, toward the early afternoon, of a Spanish naval squadron that had been at anchor in the smaller harbor of Boca Grande. 3 vessels, led by a 40-gun frigate called Nuestra Señora del Pilar, under the command of a Captain Alonso de Heredia y Campos, a man of considerable skill who had spent the morning calmly organizing his response, while the chaos in the main harbor occupied the pirates' attention. The appearance of Nuestra Señora del Pilar rounding the headland to the south, her gun ports open and her battle flag climbing her mizzen, produced a reaction among Vasconcelos's crew that was not precisely fear, but was adjacent to it. The sudden sharpening of attention that happens when men who have been operating with relative freedom realize that the parameters of the situation have changed. William Crabbe, standing at the rail of the Sangre Roja, watched the Spanish frigate come on and said something in Cornish that no one around him understood, but that his expression made clear enough. Vasconcelos looked at the approaching ship and then looked at the position of his own vessels, still partially engaged with loading operations, the longboats only halfway back from their final run to the shore, and made a rapid series of calculations. The Sangre Roja outgunned La Daga and El Silencio combined, but was still outweighed by Nuestra Señora del Pilar, and Heredia y Campos had the wind advantage, having come around the headland from the south with the afternoon trade wind behind him. He gave the order to cut and run. This decision, tactically correct and probably responsible for saving the majority of his crew, was later described by some accounts, Spanish accounts primarily, written with the benefit of wanting the story to end a certain way, as a retreat, a defeat, evidence that the Red Captain had overreached and been driven from the bay. Those accounts were not entirely wrong. He had been driven from the bay, but they left out what had been loaded onto the Sangre Roja by that point, and they left out the documents in William Crabb's coat, and they left out what Vasconcelos did in the last minutes before the longboats were hauled up and the anchors cut. He sent a single man back ashore. The man's name was Jacinto Morales, a Canarian sailor who spoke fluent Castilian and could pass, in ordinary clothing, for a merchant's factor without difficulty. Morales went ashore with a sealed leather tube and instructions to deliver it to a specific address in the Gethsemane district, not the street Vasconcelos had turned away from, but the house of a priest named Padre Geronimo de Alvarado, who had, according to Tomas's intelligence network, been one of the men who had argued for equitable distribution of the fever medicines in 1700 and had been overruled by the colonial administration. What the leather tube contained was never definitively established. Some accounts said it was a portion of the silver taken from the customs warehouse, earmarked for the district's poor, which would have been entirely consistent with the kind of calculated symbolism Vasconcelos sometimes deployed, and which made him more dangerous than a purely mercenary operator. Other accounts said it was a letter, written in his cramped hand, addressed to no one in particular, saying only that the city's debts had been partially settled and that the rest would be collected in time. A third account, less reliable but persistent, claimed the tube contained a single page torn from his logbook, the page with Cartagena's name on it, and beside it in red ink 2 of the 3 names crossed through. The third name was not crossed through. Nuestra Señora del Pilar caught up to the trailing vessel El Silencio, about 4 leagues north of the bay's mouth, as the sun dropped toward the western horizon, and the water turned the deep, saturated blue that the Caribbean achieves in the late afternoon, the color of something that has no bottom. The engagement lasted approximately 30 minutes. El Silencio's captain, a one-eyed Breton named Gaston Lemore, fought with everything his patache could offer, which was not enough, and was eventually forced to strike his colors and surrender. Heredia y Campos took the vessel as prize and took Lemore and his surviving crew as prisoners. He did not catch the Sangre Roja or La Daga, which had more canvas and a better angle on the wind, and which disappeared into the darkening north with the speed of men who have spent years learning which direction to run. Heredia y Campos, in his report to the colonial authorities, described the engagement as a Spanish victory. By certain measures it was. He had driven the pirates from the harbor, captured one of their vessels, and taken prisoners who would provide intelligence. The damage to Cartagena's harbor installations was significant but repairable. The silver taken from the customs warehouse was a loss, but not a catastrophic one. What his report did not address, because he did not know about it, or perhaps because he preferred not to, was the nature of the documents that Vasconcelos now carried north through the Caribbean night. Those documents, relating to the administrative transfer in New Granada, contained the names and scheduled movements of several colonial officials, the financial arrangements underlying the transfer, and a set of correspondence that, in the wrong hands, could be used to embarrass or implicate any number of men in the colonial administration. They were, in short, worth considerably more than the silver in the warehouse. Vasconcelos spent the night after the raid, sitting in his cabin with those documents spread across his chart table, reading by the light of a single lantern that swayed with the motion of the ship, casting shifting shadows across the walls. William Crabb knocked once, entered, set a cup of cold coffee on the corner of the table, and left without speaking. The only sounds were the creak of the hull, the rush of water along the sides, and somewhere forward, very faint, a few of the men singing a slow, formless sea shanty in the darkness. No words discernible, just the melody moving through the ship like something alive. In the weeks that followed the raid, Cartagena rebuilt what it could. The boom chain was replaced. The cranes were rebuilt. The governor, Don Sebastián de Zubicaray y Mena, wrote extensively to the viceroy in Bogotá, requesting additional naval protection, and received in reply a letter of sympathy and a promise that the matter would be reviewed at the earliest opportunity. Lieutenant Rodrigo Fuentes Alcázar, whose name had appeared in Vasconcelos' original demands, was quietly reassigned to a post in Cuba, a reassignment that may or may not have been related to the raid or to the documents now in pirate hands, and about which the colonial administration was choosing not to speak too loudly. Tomás, the stevedore, continued his work on the wharves. No one connected him to the raid. He lived another 23 years in Cartagena, raised children there, and was buried in Gethsemane, in a small cemetery near the church where the garrison musketeers had taken their positions on the night of the attack. The Sangre Roja was reported in the Windward Passage in October of 1702, then near the Cayman Islands in January of 1703, then not reliably reported for nearly a year. During that period, various sightings, none confirmed, placed Emilio Salgado de Vasconcelos in Tortuga, in Port Royal's successor settlement at Kingston, in the remote anchorages of the Bahamas, and once, in an account that was probably invention, in the harbour of Lisbon, standing on the dock looking at the house where he had grown up. He surfaced definitively in the spring of 1704, when the Sangre Roja was identified in an action near the island of Hispaniola, in which a Dutch merchant vessel was relieved of its cargo with what witnesses described as professional efficiency and no unnecessary violence. Vasconcelos, by that point, had used the administrative documents taken from Cartagena to negotiate, through intermediaries whose identities were never established, a form of informal protection from one faction of colonial officials in New Granada who found the document's sensitivity more troubling than the cost of leaving a single pirate captain alone. It was not an official pardon. It was something quieter and more durable than an official pardon. He operated for another 8 years after Cartagena, ranging as far north as the Carolina coast and as far south as the mouth of the Orinoco. He was wounded twice in that period, seriously once, and lost the Sangre Roja herself in a storm off the Bahamas in 1708. Not to any naval action, but simply to the sea, which had been waiting all along and which, in the end, collected everything. He transferred to La Daga, renamed her La Memoria, and continued. William Crabb died in 1709 of a fever contracted somewhere in the Gulf of Honduras, and was buried at sea with the kind of plain ceremony that was the closest thing to religion that most of the Sangre Roja's crew had ever practiced. The body wrapped in canvas and weighted with a cannonball, committed to the water at dawn, and afterward a silence that lasted longer than silences usually lasted on that ship. Because Crabb had been the kind of man whose absence made everything else slightly less navigable. Vasconcelos himself disappeared from the historical record in 1712. There was no confirmed account of his death, no captured vessel, no trial, no testimony extracted from crew members. The La Memoria was reported overdue from a planned rendezvous at a particular quay in the southern Bahamas, and then was simply not reported at all. The sea gave no explanation, which was consistent with its character. What remained was his logbook. It appeared in the possession of a bookseller in Kingston sometime around 1715, sold by a sailor who claimed to have found it floating in a sealed oilskin case near a nameless sandbar in the Bahamas, and who asked no questions about why it might have been there. The bookseller, understanding something of what he had, sold it within a week to a collector of maritime curiosities, an English merchant named Farquhar, with offices in Port Royal and Bristol, who kept it in a locked cabinet for the rest of his life, and showed it occasionally to trusted visitors with a mixture of pride and unease. The logbook was written in Portuguese, in a hand that was small and precise and completely consistent with itself across years of entries, sea conditions, positions, dates, cargo tallies, all rendered with the same controlled economy of expression. Near the back, in a section where the entries became less frequent and the handwriting slightly less controlled, there were the lists of names, the accounts of debts and grievances, written in the same ink as everything else, except for the notations beside each name, which were in red. Most of the names had lines through them. On the page with Cartagena's entry, 2 of the 3 names were crossed through in red. The third remained uncrossed. Beside it only a date, the date of Catalina's death, and below it, in letters that were not larger than the rest, but that seemed, to everyone who read them, to occupy more space than their size warranted, a single sentence in Portuguese: Algumas dívidas não têm preço. Some debts have no price. The page had been touched many times. The paper was slightly soft at the edges, slightly darker from the oils of a hand that had returned to it again and again, over years of night watches and long passages and the particular silence of men at sea who are reckoning with something they cannot put in a ledger. The red ink that had crossed through the 2 names was slightly smeared, not from water, not from age, but from the thumb that had dragged across them at the moment of marking, the way a man draws a line through something and then, before lifting the pen, pauses and presses down, making sure it is truly done. The third name remained clear. The red ink on the 2 crossed names had smeared, but the third name was untouched, legible, permanent. The name of no ship, no governor, no lieutenant, no merchant, just the name of a woman who had died in a city that had not tried hard enough to save her, written in the logbook of a man who had sailed 300 leagues and fired 50 cannons and burned 3 cranes and cut a chain boom and fled a battle and bargained with colonial officials and outlasted 8 years of pursuit and finally disappeared into the Caribbean's blue silence, carrying that name with him into whatever water he had gone to meet. The logbook was donated to the Municipal Archive of Kingston in 1791 by Farquhar's descendants, who included with it a note explaining that the donor wished the item preserved but had no further comment to make about its contents. It is still there. The page with Cartagena's entry is sealed behind glass now, because the paper is fragile, because the ink is old, because the archivists understand that certain things require protection from the hands of the living. But through the glass, you can read all 3 names. You can see which 2 are crossed out. You can see which one is not. And if you stand there long enough, in the particular quiet of an archive room, with the sound of the city outside and the smell of old paper around you, you can almost hear it. Not the cannons, not the screaming city, not the creak of the hull or the rush of water along the sides, but something underneath all of that, something that has no language and no melody, only the weight of a name written in a dead man's hand on a page that the sea, despite everything, chose to give back.